Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Abhijit Bhaduri. I work in the field of talent management. And today I want to introduce to you a very dear friend, Vijayanti Margassery. Actually, I mispronounced that. She has corrected me before. It is Vijayanti Margassery, popularly known as VJ. And that's how I'm going to call, VJ. This is how you will be referred to during this conversation. Is that okay?
Yes,
Thank
it is.
you.
Thanks, Abhijit.
Wonderful to have you on the show. And tell us a little about your professional career. What all are some of the places I am aware of, and you've done some interesting work recently, and I'll come to that in a moment. But tell me more.
Thanks, Abhijit. Good to speak to you after a long time. Always enriching conversations. So I started my career with teaching economics several years ago, and then moved to HR. Have been an HR professional for the last probably 23 years, and then decided that I want to go back and do what I always wanted to do, which is a PhD. And so got accepted to this PhD program at IIM Kozhikode. And the journey just is so refreshing and almost renewing, for want of better word.
I read your post on LinkedIn, and for the listeners, I'm going to add a link to that, on that post. But do go to Vijayanti's profile, and you will be able to see the last post that she's done, which is on, how our identity shifts over time. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about. And so let's dive right in.
Yep. Yes.
When we say identity, how does it get formed? I mean, we have an identity which gets shaped by, let's say, what our parents or significant people in our life, those who we grow up with, our teachers, our peer group, and all of that. In the workplace, do we evolve that identity, or does it, we are born with something and we just sharpen that? Which way is
Look
it?
at our lives, Abhijit, right? Uh, for different people, different levers at different points in time. While it is true that a lot of our early identity comes from the families we live in, our social conditioning, the environment we grow up in, right? We've heard of people say, "I'm a defense kid." We said, "Oh, I grew up in a township," or my parents had a traveling job." All that is part of our early identity formation. But as we progress with life, life's experiences take us through different transformations. Uh, that time in life where, and I saw when I was studying this, it depends on who I am, what my gender is, which part of the world I am in. All of this continues to shape our identity and we continue to evolve, right? In a good way, it's a revelation, which means I don't have to feel like I'm going to stagnate after some time.
And therefore the place that we work, the studies, all of that shapes us, so we inherit a couple of things. For example, you might say, I'm from so and so family, which means that your family is what is the prime identity that you have, and then everything else is an add-on. Or as you said, I'm a defense kid. That's, your parents profession is what is shaping you. Is that cultural, in the sense that if I was born in a different country, then would I introduce myself in a different way? And is that how identity would get shaped?
It is possible, isn't it? Because as humans, and I'm not the scientist, and I'm not the most deep researcher, but just sheer experience and observation tells me that when I begin to identify myself with something outside of me, I
Hmm.
automatically begin to believe that that is also me. And therefore, the organizations I work for become me, and it's called social categorization. I start to behave like the organization is. Or, for that matter, the school I went to becomes a part of me, as if maybe it's good, but as if there is no other agency in me other than all these identities that I start to collect.
So is
Uh,
it better to have a sort of a single, sharply defined point of view about your identity, or is it like a collage? For example, if somebody says, I am from so and so family, which is very well known, or I'm a doctor, men very often will introduce themselves by their profession.
Mm.
Of course, I've also seen equal number of people introduce themselves by the title that I am the vice president of so and so thing. Yeah, when they come in on a social gathering, so he's visiting my home and he says, I'm vice president of so and so. But that's not why you are at home. You are in a different capacity.
50. If
Hmm.
I had not been 50, I'd have never understood how transitioning this particular frame or this reference point is, because a couple of the men that I spoke to during my interview, I would have, and I know them, right? I've known them. I would have never thought that they'd probably be looking at their identity so differently from when they were younger. So, to your question, if I got it right, is it okay to hold on to this identity steadfast? Where I am after studying this, I don't think it's real anymore. I don't think people in their 50s want to hold on to those same identities, because at least the people I spoke to realize that those identities are no longer as significant. I won't say not relevant, but those identities are no longer as significant as some of the others that they've started to discover. Um, did I make sense,
Yes,
Abhijit?
and my question would be that is it not significant because the people, once they reach their 50s, their growth in the organization, the pace of
Ah,
growth, velocity
mhm.
slows down. So, when you are younger, you're getting a promotion every couple of years and you are getting your increments and you're, moving from one assignment to another. And then once you reach a certain kind of an age and designation in the organization, that pace slows down because there aren't that many spots to go, and perhaps you have already reached there, or if you haven't, then you've lost the race, and that's very clear. So, what does it do to identity, and how do people deal with that?
Very interesting you asked this. While you were asking this question, it struck me that, when our parents went to work, Abhijit, right, in the 70s or in the 80s, you didn't see this so much of an intergenerational workplace, which means you probably saw a max of two generations of people work together, right? The bosses that were probably in their 50s that would retire, and then these youngsters who would huddle around these bosses, and that equation. But if you walk into a workplace today, I have a peer who's half my age. And I'm probably in a startup reporting to a CEO who is probably my son's age. And therefore, the multi generationality of the workplace complicates this further for an individual uh, in their 50s, or, with respect to what their identity looks like, because there's no longer the same authority that defines you. Your role and title is only as valid as your relevance to the job, and how much relevance you bring to the new ways of thinking, and how willing you are uh, to break down some of the paradigms you've constructed for yourself in your head about what your career looks like. And I think that is the key to identity, which is how fast am I willing to break what I've held on to strongly for too long?
Is this what, in popular terms, we define as reinventing yourself? Is that what it is? Or
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is called an identity transformation. Transformation sounds like a big word, but it's a switch, right? You have to know when to switch.
so, do people switch their identity when, let's say, I'm moving from being a sort of individual contributor to a team manager? Is that also an identity switch, or if that happens only when I change my employer or my profession? That I used to be a compensation specialist, now I am a generalist. Is that when it happens? What are these moments?
You've been a head of talent, Abhijit, and you've been a head of talent for some of these really large behemoths of organizations, right? And we've forever trained people who were youngsters working for themselves. We've trained them to say, once you become a manager, think about the other, put yourself, move yourself to a secondary space, think of the team, work with the team. That is an identity transformation. And in our careers, if you look at our lifespan, in our career span, all our careers, from individual contributors to, let's say, you become a CEO or a vice president or whatever, you're constantly rebuilding and what is the word for it? Cementing that which is that you're growing because there are more followers, right? There are more people behind you that are looking up to you, right? And that is an identity transformation, and it takes years to build. We go through our self-esteem issues. We go through our, am I good enough for this? Women go through imposter syndrome. They go through the double bind of, should I behave like this or whatever? That is an identity transformation. But at the end of it, we seem to be very resistant to shift back to what our real identity is. Possibly we've even forgotten that we had an identity that is outside of our job. Am I making
Yes,
sense?
absolutely. And you brought up an interesting idea, which I want to sort of delve a little deeper into. And you talked about, specifically, you said that women sort of deal with it differently. What's the
Hmm.
basic difference between the way men deal with changes in their identity or reinventing themselves from the
Hmm.
point of view of somebody who's not necessarily conversant in this terminology? I would sort of use the word reinvention to simplify the entire thing. Yeah.
Sure,
So,
sure.
as I have moved from being a student to an employee, there has been a reinvention, and
Yes.
there is also a reinvention happening in my personal life. So I get married, I have a reinvention that now I am not just an individual or a son or a daughter or whatever. I'm also a husband or a wife or a partner, and then you become a parent, and that's another reinvention. And you are inheriting a whole lot of relationships. Are relationships the foundation of reinvention, and therefore do you give up your relationships in order to reinvent yourself? Is that how it'll work?
It's very interesting, at least with the audiences that with my participants, right, in the survey that I undertook, and women from all across, all fields. It's very interesting that in their 50s, the identity transformation for the women I spoke with was more about identifying with oneself, putting herself at the fore of this this shift or switch became more relevant to a woman, whereas for a man, and some of the men I spoke to were very accomplished professionals in industry, was about reconnecting with a purpose that was not just working for an organization or serving an enterprise, but being mentors or being, contributing back to society, and letting future professionals thrive under their mentorship. Whereas for women, it was very individualistic. I'd like to go back and do things that I don't think I could do all these years. And I was talking to one of my professors, and he had a very interesting question. And he says, why do you think men and women's lives are very different? And I was able to explain, though he was not convinced, because of course he's a deep researcher. I'm just a student, fumbling. But you think about this. Imagine that there are two paths to life. And let's say that a man and a woman start their career at 21, for example. Okay. And let me talk with an Indian context, because I've studied the Indian context more. At 21, the two people start together. And let's not even talk about the other genders who we've not even started to study. All right. from an equity perspective. But let's take men and women for the binary for now. And then at 24, a woman in India has to drop everything that she's created so far. So she undergoes a loop of, let's say, marriage. And in India, in most marriages, women have to make the shift out of their current lives. So they go through a loop. By then, the man's career has progressed linearly. All right. But the woman's sitting in the backward loop of what she's potentially taken. And then our gendered organizational spaces don't see this as a legitimate life of a woman. So she starts a journey. And then, so by the time you've hit a 20-year career space, the woman's probably gone through 3 or 4 loop-like transitions to get to where she's gotten. And therefore, I'm not surprised that most of the women I spoke to said, now I'm building my individual identity, notwithstanding that I have a family and friends and all of that to look after. But this is now about me. And therefore, I go and create a new world for myself. So, long story, long answer to this question, Abhijit, but I hope I've answered this.
But is identity formation then all about being selfish in some way or being self centered in some way?
Is it wrong to look
I'm
after
asking.
oneself? Yeah, I mean, is it selfish? Or I know a long time ago,
Selfish and self centered are probably slightly different shades.
they
Uh,
are.
but yeah, I mean, but does that necessarily become the reason how transformations happen? That you have to look within, and that makes you self centered because you realize the gaps, and that is what is actually triggering the direction in which you wish to reinvent yourself. Is that how it'll be?
It's very interesting you use selfish and self-centered. A very old friend of mine used the word selfism. In a difficult conversation that I was having with him, he said, selfism is important, which means identifying with one's core, and being clear about what one wants in order to continue to remain mentally healthy for the future. I think that's very crucial. So there are different words to it, but looking after oneself was never a crime.
No, it isn't. But also, if you look at Eric Erickson's stages of growth, he actually talks about the fact that at the end, it's, ego despair versus ego integration, and sort of you are fully collected versus you're
Yeah.
fragmented, and that's in some sense to me, it's also the identity that you're talking about
Yes, absolutely.
when and as you said that when women get married, they give up a lot of their past in some sense. Chinmay Tumbe has a fantastic book on migration,
Mm.
and one of the most insightful statements that I found when I was chatting with him at some stage was that he talks about the largest amount of migrants in India are the women. And I
Yes.
said, really, how? And he said, no, very simple. They give up their home and go migrate into another state, another city, or at the very least to a different address. And when you look at it from that point of view, a change of a location also transforms your identity in some sense. Because, when you started off by saying, I'm a small town person, I'm a Bombay person, I'm a Delhi guy, all of these towns also become part of our identity. And so when you make that shift, that's there. And then of course you are going through, do you have to give up your professional aspirations? Do you want to give up your own dreams of traveling or your hobbies? That people make many different things, and there are communities in which women give up their past surnames. It's very common, and in many
Even their
cases,
first names.
and their first names also. I was just coming to that, that they are not only giving up their last name, they're also giving up their first name. So in some sense, imagine if tomorrow I had to be known by a completely different name, Sanjay Devedi. Would I identify with that, and what does it do to the individual? That's a fascinating question for me. That What does it do? How does it play out?
It's very confusing. And I'll give you a very related example. I was born left-handed, Abhijit, and you know how left-handedness in India is.
Stigma.
Fortunately, Yeah, fortunately, in the 70s in Calcutta, my parents found a very good pediatrician who said, do not change her hand orientation because it could impact the brain. Um, and yet, in my growing up years, being left-handed seemed to be social ostracization in public places. Now, think about this in parallel to a woman's identity that you've grown up in a certain condition. One, it's debatable whether that's been, liberating and empowering and all of that. Let's forget all of that. But you grew up being conditioned in a certain place, and then you're suddenly uprooted, whether it's by choice or by force. Let's say it's even choice. Let's assume all the good things. And you shift. There is an implicit expectation that you are so you are such a unique and exalted being that you will automatically fit in like a car's gears. And that is where I think the whole situation just becomes awry, because you are not expected to fail. But let's be fair to the men as well. Men in India grow up from childhood expected to be superheroes. And so there is that side as well, that, there's no gender to this, right? So therefore, our men, most of the time, are walking around not understanding that it's human to fail and human to not be successful all the time, and not have this whole brave front all the time. So yeah, I think acknowledgement early on, coming back to different stages of identity transformation, acknowledgement that we are constantly going to have to adjust to what life throws at us. And in the last 20 years, the way technology has taken over, I see a lot of us not even thinking that it's important to get on the bandwagon, um, is real. For some genders, it is far more difficult. And for some genders, they probably go through it without even recognizing it.
And, you sort of touched on something that I was talking to another former colleague of mine, Dr. Vishal Shah.
Ah,
And
yes.
Vishal was actually talking about this whole idea that, until generative AI came in,
Mm.
um, you know, coding was the language of communication with the machines. Yeah. And actually, if you see the way organizations have been structured, it's that people at the top look after strategy and all the fancy things, and the execution work, and so to say, has been pushed downwards. Now, a lot of that work which has been pushed downwards is going to be done by machines. So in
Yes.
some sense, that's what it is, which actually then leads to this whole question that if that work is being done, you will need the human beings to be far more strategic, to be far more creative. And we hear that humans will do more creative work. But we are never asking people to be creative and strategic at a junior stage. I mean, imagine if how often have you seen somebody, who's early in their career being sent to something on strategic thinking, because the whole idea is that, well, what are you going to do with it, because that's meant to be for the people at the top. That's going to change. I'm wondering, you were talking about multi-gen workforce. I always like to say that in this multi-gen, we now have Gen AI also as another gen. And how is that changing identity?
Oh, but this is a very interesting question. The last startup that I worked in, my founders said, we are cutting down coding time from 80 hours to 8 hours, which means we're building a product in that speed. When you look at how corporate life, at least what I've seen around me, look at Gen AI, there's still this whole suspicion. And I find myself talking to some of my colleagues saying, in the 90s, when computers first started to come in, I was in college, and my parents sent me to a computer class. to say, you need to learn computers, Excel, and we always thought that that's going to take over. And we will still have professions where we don't have to use computers. And look at where we are right now. Many people, many professionals in my generation resist the idea of using AI. Whereas I believe adoption of this technology, whether you like it or not, can be one way in which people of my age or even youngsters are, anyways, bought into this. But people of my generation can break this plateau, or break this invisible ceiling or wall that they've built around themselves about what to do next, right?
Mm.
Youngsters use Gen AI like a tool. Where people of my generation can use it better is that we have a context and we have a legacy and body of work that we've built over 20-25 years. That can't be replaced. There is no substitute for history. And therefore, learning to use Gen AI as a tool that allows you to contextualize for the current workplace is what we need to start looking at.
When you look at what AI is getting trained on, it is what has been documented, which is the documented part of word, video, written word, etc. All of that, and it's sort of read up every word. But there is, before this written word, outside of the written word, there is a ton, and majority of my life is not documented, right?
Correct. Correct.
I may have had a great conversation with a friend of mine, which is not documented. So, and all these experiences, all the tacit knowledge, the wisdom, and all of that that one gathers over time, that's not documented. So, Gen AI is getting trained on only what is documented, leaving a vast amount of stuff with us that we are going to rely on humans to provide and bring to the workplace. So, Gen AI is also actually getting limited in some shape or form to our, what is available to train it.
Absolutely. And I see that in my work. Today, I don't think I would be able to work without Gen AI because there are many things that play in my head, and I don't know how to structure it into something that's useful at work. Uh, and therefore, Gen AI is able to pull it all together. But if I know what questions to ask and how to make it work for me. And I find this resistance very foolish, for want of a better word.
Discovered as I was working on my last book, Career 3.0, which broadly the premise is that we used to have a linear career, which is Career 1.0, where you learn, earn, and retire. You join the organization and you sort of go through that and retire, which potentially my parents' generation actually experienced that. And then we started living longer, skills started disappearing faster, and also organizations die out faster. Given all of that, what started to happen was very often people started to monetize their hobbies. So we saw
Hmm.
it in a very big way in COVID that people started to become known more for their baking and their art or something else, or their music, than something else that they had potentially done before. So that's Career 2.0, where you're managing two of them. And Career 3.0, which I think is going to be the future, is going to be a portfolio of different things, some which are hobbies at some stage, you monetize at a different stage, and your different parts of your life all get stitched together. And that's going to be the way that our identity is going to get formed over time, because
Yes.
it's not going to be defined only by your employer. It's going to be defined more by you, because you'll change employers so often. It's like changing a city. I'm not defined by the city that I lived in anymore, because I have moved so many times. I'm potentially also not necessarily defined by every organization that I worked in also, because I've worked in multiple organizations. That's what will go. Is that a valid hypothesis?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So some of the things that will now start to look as a paradigm for careers is A, my portfolio is my impact and not the ladders I've climbed. Abhijit, today, if somebody called on you, they'd not be calling on you for the career that you build in corporate. I'm sure that's not what you're getting called for,
Sure.
right? Number two, I measure my success by the problems I solve and the systems I shape, not by the salary I earn or the title I uh, suffix, to my name. Number three, reinvention is not a luxury anymore. It has become what we have to live with every single day. And COVID taught us that, right? I hope we never have another COVID-like situation, but that is key. Number four, somebody in my interview said this. It said, I made a note of it because I wanted to share it. It says, my next decade is not a wind down, it's a reframe. Vulnerability is not a liability. So just to go back to what you said, right? Uh, what is the repertoire of things that I have done and kept in my kitty uh, to help me live through the 20 extra years that I will live that my parents didn't live? And everybody in this generation has made money. But it is that, when my mother sits at her window, she's 80, she sits at her window, and she's able to still sew and knit and, embroider, and just using this as a term. I wonder whether I have that when I'm going to be 80. And I don't think many of us have thought about it, right? The friends will go, your generation will leave, you will have nobody to speak with. And then what do you do?
We are
So
coming to
sorry.
the end of our times. I just loved
Sure.
the four or five things that you said, that, my impact is what I am known for rather than the ladders I've climbed. And, I just thought there were some really fabulous things. So, what I would say is it's also based on the conversations I have been able to have with people who are different from me, because that is
Right.
actually what will help you to reinvent yourself. That if you've never spoken to like somebody who's much younger, very different from you in some shape or form, one of the things that happens when we meet somebody who's completely different, we have two reactions. It's that fight or fight kind of a mode. One is either I'm completely gobsmacked, and so I keep quiet. I have nothing to talk to you, because there's not, sometimes you see that happening when you visit somebody's home and the kid comes in who's like all of 5 or 6 years old, and people have only three questions to ask: what is your name, which school do you go to, which grade are you in? And after that, there's silence because they have not thought of a fourth question to ask. Or yeah.
Yeah.
The other option is, in that situation, to have curiosity, because
Yeah.
that is actually what allows you to bridge the generations and have conversations with people, and that's what helps you to reinvent yourself.
That's true.
Last word to summarize your wisdom into 1 minute or 2 minutes of what we can
Half
do
a minute.
about this.
Um, don't, I would tell myself this, right? Don't fix yourself to something for too long. And if there is something that you're fixed to for too long, it's time to consciously make the shift. And, I was reflecting, Abhijit, I saw your place where you're sitting and doing what you're doing right now. And I said, look at how this person's gone to a place where, and how do I get there? To your question of meeting a 5-year-old child and not having any questions to ask. The curiosity is key, right? And believing that one can do more than one has had an opportunity to do, I think is key.
Fantastic. The other day I was chatting with somebody, and she asked that what is it, you've got a chair below those two cartoons which are there. Uh, you know, I said that chair is for the muse, to continuously stay there. I want the muse to stay with me and keep inspiring me. Uh, Vijay, it's wonderful. You have no idea how many ideas you sparked in me as I've heard you. And thank you so very much for enriching my life with this conversation, and of course, the listeners. And how does one get in touch with you? Would you like to share where people can find you? What is the easiest way to connect with you and learn more about your work? And because I think you're doing some phenomenal work, and I just was so blown away by the article that you wrote on LinkedIn, that I definitely think you should pin it, and so that people have easy access to it. But where do they connect with you?
On LinkedIn is the safest place, and I'm normally very responsive, Abhijit. That's where I am most active. But I'm grateful for this opportunity, Abhijit, as always. To find a true mentor in you is just amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Goodbye.